spooky place.
Imagine this. You're deep in the woods, the kind of place where the trees seem to whisper and the shadows move when you're not looking. The fire's died out, and the only sound is the crunch of leaves under something or someone's feet. You tell yourself it's just the wind, but then the zipper on your tent starts to move. Slowly, deliberately. What do? Run? Scream? Pray? Tonight's story isn't just about a group of campers who vanished in the forest. It's about what they became, and why the forest is still hungry. So, before you listen any further, make sure your doors are locked, your lights are on, and you're ready to face the chilling truth. They're still camping. The shadow on the tent. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the cold, biting wind. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver glow over the campsite. Inside the small, flimsy tent, 5 campers lay huddled in their sleeping bags, their breaths visible in the frosty air. The fire outside had long since died, leaving only embers and the faint scent of burnt wood. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding, of ghost stories and marshmallows. But now, as the sound of shuffling footsteps crept closer to their tent, the campers wished they had stayed home. The first to wake was Emma, her heart pounding as her eyes snapped open. She lay still, listening. The sound was unmistakable. Something was outside. Something big. The shadow that passed over the tent was tall, impossibly so. Its silhouette distorted and unnatural, like a man stretched too thin. Her breath hitched, and she nudged Jake, who slept beside her. He groaned, half asleep, until he saw the shadow too. His eyes widened, and he froze. One by one, the others woke. Lila, Marcus, and Ryan. No one spoke. No one dared to. The shadow moved again, this time circling the tent, its footsteps slow and deliberate. The zipper on the tent door began to move, inch by inch, as if someone, or something, was teasing them, savoring their fear. What do? Lila mouthed, her hands trembling. Before anyone could answer, the zipper stopped. The shadow disappeared. The campers exchanged uneasy glances, their relief short-lived. Then a low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. "We need to get out of here," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. But as they scrambled to gather their things, the zipper began to move again, faster this time. The tent door flapped open, and a cold gust of wind rushed in, extinguishing their flashlight. Darkness enveloped them. Emma screamed as something grabbed her ankle, yanking her toward the opening. Jake lunged for her, but the force was too strong. She was dragged out into the night, her cries echoing through the forest. The remaining campers stared at each other in horror. "We have to go after her," Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. Reluctantly, they crawled out of the tent, their eyes scanning the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Emma's screams had stopped. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under their feet as they ventured deeper into the woods, following the faint trail of disturbed foliage. Then they saw it. A figure stood in the distance, its back to them. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. Emma lay at its feet, unmoving. The campers froze, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both human and not, a grotesque mask of stretched skin and hollow eyes. It smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice a blend of whispers and growls. Marcus was the first to break. He turned and ran, the others following close behind. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The sound of the creature's laughter chased them, growing louder with every step. Branches clawed at their faces, and roots tripped them, but they kept running, driven by sheer terror. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, they collapsed onto the dirt road, gasping for air. The laughter had stopped. The forest was silent once more. But as they looked back, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Emma was standing at the tree line, her eyes blank, her mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. She raised a hand, pointing at them, and whispered a single word, "Run." And then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The campers made it back to town, shaken but alive. They told their story to the police, to anyone who would listen, but no one believed them. How could they? There was no evidence, no body, no tracks, nothing. The forest was searched, but it yielded no answers. Emma was declared missing, and the case was closed. Months passed. Life moved on, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He started seeing things, shadows in the corners of his vision, figures standing in the distance. He told himself it was just his imagination, the trauma of that night playing tricks on him. Then, one evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he heard it. The sound of shuffling footsteps outside his door. His heart raced as the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the hallway, was Emma. She looked the same, but her eyes were wrong. She smiled, that same twisted smile, and stepped inside. "You shouldn't have left me," she said, her voice a chilling blend of her own and something else. Jake's scream was cut short as the door slammed shut behind her. The next morning, Jake's apartment was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that anything had happened. But on the wall, written in what looked like blood, were 3 words. "We're still camping." And in the forest, deep within the trees, a new shadow moved among the tents. Tall, thin, and unnatural, the zipper began to move. The forest had always been a place of mystery, but now it was something darker, a living, breathing entity that seemed to watch and wait. The campers who had survived that night tried to forget, but the forest wouldn't let them. It called to them in their dreams, whispering promises of answers and threats of retribution. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. Lila was the first to go back. She couldn't explain why. It was as if something had taken hold of her mind, pulling her toward the woods like a moth to a flame. She packed a bag, told her roommate she was going on a hike, and never returned. Her phone was found a week later, lying in the middle of a clearing. The screen was cracked, and the last photo she had taken was of the trees, blurred as if she had been running. In the background, barely visible, was a figure, tall, thin, and unnatural. Marcus was next. He had been the most vocal about never returning to the forest, but the nightmares became too much. He claimed he saw Emma in his dreams, her hollow eyes pleading with him to come back. "She's still there," he would mutter over and over. "She's waiting for us." One night, he left his apartment without a word. His car was found abandoned at the edge of the woods, the driver's door wide open. Inside, the radio was playing static, and the seat was stained with something dark and wet. Ryan lasted the longest. He moved to another state, changed his number, and tried to start over. But the forest followed him. He would wake up to find dirt on his floor, leaves on his bed, and the faint sound of laughter outside his window. He started carrying a knife, sleeping with the lights on, but it wasn't enough. One morning, his landlord found his apartment empty. The windows were locked from the inside, but Ryan was gone. On the kitchen table was a note, written in shaky handwriting. It's not just Emma. There are more of them. A year after the original group's disappearance, another set of campers arrived at the forest. They were young, reckless, and unaware of the stories that surrounded the area. They laughed as they set up their tents, joking about ghosts and monsters. But as the sun set and the forest grew dark, their laughter faded. The first night was uneventful. They told stories around the fire, drank beer, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets. But on the second night, things changed. One of them, a girl named Sarah, woke up to the sound of shuffling outside her tent. She shook her boyfriend, Chris, awake, and they both listened as the footsteps circled their tent. The zipper began to move. "Who's there?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. The zipper stopped, and the footsteps retreated. Relieved, Chris unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest was still, the moon casting long shadows across the ground. But as he turned to go back inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. Tall, thin, and unnatural. Its head tilted to the side, and it smiled, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched too far. Chris stumbled back into the tent, slamming the zipper shut. "We need to leave. Now," he whispered, but it was too late. The laughter began, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. The other campers woke up, their faces pale with fear. They packed their things as quickly as they could, but the forest seemed to shift around them, the paths they had taken now leading them deeper into the woods. One by one, they were picked off. Sarah was the first, dragged into the darkness as she tried to start the car. Chris followed, his screams cut short as something pulled him into the trees. The others ran, but the forest was alive, its branches clawing at them, its roots tripping them. By morning, there was no one left. Months later, a hiker stumbled upon the abandoned campsite. The tents were torn, the supplies scattered. Curious, the hiker began to search the area, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. That's when they found the journal. It belonged to Emma, one of the original campers. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, descriptions of the shadowy figure and its laughter. But the last entry was the most chilling. It's not just one of them. There's a whole colony. They've been here for centuries, feeding on fear, on souls. They take you, twist you, make you one of them. Jay tried to fight it, but it was too strong. Now he's with them, and soon I will be too. If you're reading this, leave. Don't look back. Don't come looking for us. We're not who we were. We're not human anymore. The hiker closed the journal, their hands shaking. As they turned to leave, they heard it, the sound of shuffling footsteps. They froze, their heart pounding. Slowly, they turned around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall, thin, and unnatural. Behind it, more figures emerged from the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on the hiker. And at the front of the group was Emma, her twisted smile wider than ever. "Welcome," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The hiker tried to run, but the forest closed in around them, the laughter echoing through the trees. And as the shadows swallowed them whole, one thought crossed their mind. They're still camping. The hiker's screams were swallowed by the forest, their voice joining the chorus of those who had come before. The figures, tall, thin, and grotesque, closed in, their elongated limbs moving with unnatural grace. The hiker's final moments were a blur of terror. The sight of Emma's hollow eyes, the feel of cold, bony hands gripping their arms, and the sound of that laughter, deep, guttural, and endless. When it was over, the forest fell silent once more. The hiker was gone, but their presence lingered, absorbed into the colony. Another soul twisted and reshaped into something unrecognizable. The colony feasted that night, not on flesh, but on fear. It was their sustenance, their lifeblood. Each new victim added to their power, their numbers growing with every camper, hiker, or wanderer who dared to enter their domain. The forest itself seemed to pulse with their energy, the trees growing taller, the shadows darker, the air thicker with the stench of decay. The colony was no longer just a group of lost souls. It was a force, a living nightmare that stretched its influence beyond the woods, calling to the vulnerable, the curious, the desperate. Years later, a documentary crew arrived at the edge of the forest, determined to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. They had heard the stories, read the journal, and even tracked down the families of the missing. Armed with cameras, drones, and a sense of invincibility, they ventured into the woods, unaware of the horror that awaited them. The footage they captured was chilling. The drone showed strange shapes moving between the trees, shadows that didn't align with the light. The audio picked up whispers, laughter, and the occasional scream. But the most disturbing moment came when they found a tent, old, torn, and covered in moss. Inside was a camera, still functional, its battery inexplicably charged. The footage on it showed the original campers, Emma, Jake, Lila, Marcus, and Ryan, alive but changed. Their eyes were hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. They spoke in unison, their voices blending into one haunting message. You shouldn't have come back. The crew tried to leave, but the forest had other plans. Their equipment failed, their compasses spun wildly, and the paths they had marked disappeared. One by one, they were taken, their screams echoing through the trees. The last piece of footage showed the crew's lead investigator, Sarah, standing in the clearing, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, the colony emerged from the shadows, their twisted smiles gleaming in the moonlight. We're still camping, Sarah whispered, her voice no longer her own. And then the screen went dark. The documentary was never released. The crew's equipment was found months later, scattered and broken, deep within the forest. The footage was deemed too disturbing to air, locked away in a vault, labeled classified. But the force wasn't done. It began to spread, its influence seeping into nearby towns. People reported hearing laughter in the dead of night, seeing shadows move where there should be none, and finding dirt and leaves in their homes. Some disappeared, their belongings left behind, their last words often the same: we're still camping. The colony was no longer confined to the woods. It had grown, evolved, and now it hungered for more. The forest was just the beginning. The world was next, and somewhere, deep within the trees, Emma smiled. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.